Russia is in a proxy war with NATO. That's the ominous declaration of Sergei Lavrov, the Kremlin's foreign minister, who warned Russia may be prepared to go nuclear to attack the West. Well, it's been a threat that has been repeatedly made since the invasion of Ukraine as allies arm Kiev to repel Russian forces. But is it really a threat we should take seriously? Or is it buying into Kremlin propaganda, playing Putin's games by swallowing Russian bravado? The warning of James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is in Moscow today, meeting Lavrov and Putin with little hope of a breakthrough. Despite Russia's invasion clearly not going to plan, Putin has continued to double down, with no sign that he's prepared to walk away. Does this mean a long and costly conflict? Or, as an act of desperation, could Mad Vlad push the big red button? It's a gamble with Armageddon most world leaders aren't willing to take, as the war in Ukraine marks the start of its third month. Surely something has got to give. The big question is what? Well, Dr. Alan Mendoza joins me now. He's the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, which is a foreign policy and national security think tank. Alan, fantastic to have you back on the show. We've heard these warnings from Russia repeatedly, haven't we? That, you know, if NATO do this, we're going to retaliate. We're now hearing that Finland and Sweden might be announcing their application to join NATO next month. Does this show that we're beginning to ignore the Russian threats, and are we wise to do so?
Well, the Russian threats so far, aren't really codified in anything approaching, if you like, tangible action. So the Russians saying this and that, threatening nuclear war. I mean, you might say nuclear war is a tangible action, but it isn't really, because the idea they would launch nuclear missiles which would bring destruction upon themselves is just fanciful. So for a threat to really be effective, it has to be a credible deterrent and threat. I think you saw a little more of that when Lavrov was claiming that Russia would shoot down or try to intercept Western arms supplies to Ukraine. But again, that's not the kind of threat that's likely to dissuade us, is it? Given that we want to defend Ukraine as much as possible. So yes, there is always a path and a place for threats in the context of diplomacy and war. But nonetheless, at the moment, the Russians aren't giving us anything really to worry us too much on that score.
Well, should we not therefore up the ante? I mean, those who are close to Putin have said that he doesn't seem to be veering away from his plan. His aims and objectives remain the same. He seems to be potentially trying to expand the theatre of war into Transnistria in Moldova. Do we not risk this sort of playing on for years and years and years, tearing up Ukraine in the process, unless the West turn around and say enough is enough and really push back hard?
Well, then you might, of course, be the one starting a war, which is a slightly different process. I think I'm all in favour of a tough approach here, but realistically, there are certain paradigms, I think we've sort of forgotten now. The Cold War played out, and here's sort of like a Cold War conflict with one of the sides facing another through a proxy moment. We've forgotten that in the Cold War there were certain rules that you followed. You wouldn't have Americans and Russians going toe-to-toe, but when the Americans were in Vietnam, for example, the Russians were supplying the North Vietnamese, in some cases even manning some combat operations, on the ground with planes and things like that, in order to damage the Americans. Equally, when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, it wasn't Americans they were facing, but it was American kit that was being used by the local, kind of forces to oppose. So, the powers know what goes on in terms of conflict zones, and they know what is essentially a clear red line beyond which you don't go. Now, you're not going to put troops in on that basis. You might supply more equipment, but there's going to be that game played in that capability about, look, this is plausible deniability, or as close to the line as we can get without crossing it. Your move. And what we're constantly trying to do with the Russians is saying, it's your move. If you want to attack us, then that's your business to start the war. We're not going to attack you, and we know where the red lines are.
But how does this play out? I mean, roll the clock forward, 6 months, 6 years. I can't put a duration on it, but where are we going to end up? Because I get the impression Russia can't walk away without some kind of scalp.
Well, that seems to be the case, obviously, from Putin. But of course, don't forget, Putin controls all the propaganda in Russia. So as a result, he might be able to declare a victory on something that we wouldn't necessarily recognize as a victory, a fudge, if you like. Now, I think a fudge is your best bet to get out of this quickly. I think he's got a date coming up. We all know the 9th of May, the Victory Day parade in Moscow. He would love to be able to roll out some kind of victory for then, which might presage an end of the war. Now, that would, of course, depend on him either being able to actually present a real win or something that would look, credible from his side to do there. So I think we're all waiting, aren't we, for the impact of the Russian offensive that's going to be starting, we believe, in the east of Ukraine soon. And that's going to be the key determinant. How far does that get? Does it give him enough room for a victory? If it doesn't, you're right, he's going to need to hang on until he gets something. And that could be a very long and very costly war, both for Russia, Ukraine, but for all of us.
Dr. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, and good friend of this programme. Fantastic to have you back on. Well, let's go back.